I'm just going to make a few comments in response to the questions that were submitted to us. So we received maybe 3 pages of very specific, very detailed questions about the school, and I think mostly from parents. And Mike said, if you were to respond to all of those, can you hear me? Yeah, okay, so I know Mike had said if you were to respond to all those questions, we'd be here for 2 weeks or so. So I'll try to sort of narrow that down to about 20 minutes of just my reflections on some of these questions. But so what I'd really like to talk about from my own kind of experience as a teacher, as an elementary school teacher, and also as a scholar, somebody who reads a lot of books about education, somebody who's spent a lot of time in schools in the United States, but also as a parent of 2 elementary school children, and also an active member of the PTA, which is the Parent-Teacher Association at the school that my children attend. I'd just like to reflect on specifically curriculum. There are a lot of questions about curriculum, about how to deepen and how to enrich the curriculum at a democratic school, as well as about professional development, because those are 2 endlessly fascinating and difficult issues, I think, for any school, but probably especially for a new school, one that you're just trying to get get the landing gear up and getting the plane up in the sky. So there are a few basic principles that I think about when I think about curriculum and about just teaching. What is teaching? And especially from a child-centered point of view, from children being, the standard, as John Dewey used to say, we don't just measure students according to a standard, that the child is the standard. So how do we then think about, okay, well, how do you present the opportunities for learning for these students? And the first thing to say about that is that, from my point of view, teaching is really about relationships, okay? And the parents are the first teachers, right? So you have your children at home, and you have parents, and of course, most parents, I think all parents, really want to teach their child everything that they know. And, so it's really not surprising when I look around, at least to the friends that I grew up with, and, sort of what they became in their lives. There's a phrase in the United States, the apple doesn't fall very far from the tree, which means that very oftentimes, children become very similar to their parents in one way or another, right? So it's not maybe an accident that both of my parents are educators. My mother was a preschool teacher for about 35 years, and my father was a principal. Now, my father came from a family that had an 8th grade education, and so he has the narrative about pulling himself up by the bootstraps and teaching himself everything that he learned. But even there, you can see kind of the apple not falling very far from the tree from his parents in other ways besides just profession. So education is about a relationship. So you have children, and of course you create a strong attachment with them. You create a caring environment for them. You have that trust that the child knows that you are going to provide for them. And with that trust, then you can start to impart wisdom. And sometimes there is punishment and rewards that go along with that. But really, I think the cognitive revolution that has happened over the past 40 years has shown that the carrot and the stick idea of behaviorism, this idea that people, and children in particular, only respond to punishments or rewards, is not accurate. That in fact there are motivations that are internal to us besides just punishments and rewards. And probably one of the most central motivations is the motivation to cultivate relationships. And to cultivate caring relationships, to cultivate trust and love and a bond strategically with particular people, not just anybody, right? But the person who is your primary attachment as a child, right? And so then the question, I think, for older children, for primary school teachers is, does the teacher create that attachment? What kind of attachment does the child make with that primary school teacher? And John Bowlby, who is kind of the pioneer of this attachment theory, he and other folks talked about secondary attachments, right? So what teachers can do is they can create a situation where teachers want to create a secondary attachment with the children. And that trusting relationship then will lead on to a give and take relationship of teaching one another, listening and talking and experiencing things together that then creates a very fertile relationship in which lots of information can be taken and given and built in that way, right? And so I think at the fundamental level, teaching is about creating that attachment, that secondary set of attachments. And then, of course, students also want to create relationships with their peers, right? And so, strategically, it's not every peer. You know, they want to have a relationship with this peer, but not that other peer. And so that cultivation of relationship is a strong motivator that doesn't need punishments and rewards. It is a motivator, internal motivator for the students themselves. And so how do we understand that and then create situations in which we understand that cultivating of relationships are happening, but we can also insert particular ways of doing that might be more academic, right? So maybe you'll insert some books inside of that cultivation of relationship. So it's not a accident that attachment theorists, for example, have noticed that reading with your child either creates that attachment or attachment actually is benefited from reading with a child, right? And so, and if you read with a child, that makes a child want to read more, right? So reading with a child at night, before they go to bed, or some situation where there's both intimacy and also language and also literacy, even from before children are able to speak or before they're able to read or whatever, that has been found to actually motivate children to read later in life, right? So these are some of the scholarly, I guess, theories that I think about when I use that lens to look at education. So what do we want to teach our children, I think, is a big question. And of course, democracy is one of the primary things that we are trying to teach our kids, to become democratic citizens, but also to have a voice in their education right now, immediately, and not wait, right? So democracy is part of what they're learning, and leadership is also part of what they're learning. So they're learning how to run a meeting, they're learning how to have a conversation, they're learning how to listen, how to organize, how to deliberate, all of these kinds of things. And it's based on this relationship, but it's also based on an internship, right? There used to be this economic model in the United States. That's how you would learn any profession, is through an internship, right? So you would study at the feet or in the workshop of a master, somebody who was really doing that in a professional way. And I think we can look at a lot of different projects or a lot of curricular areas through that internship model. And I think democracy is one thing that you can learn through an internship. Well, you are studying other people who are practicing it. They might be novices, but they also might be masters at how to run a meeting based on Robert's rules or based on some other protocol or some other format. So I guess what I would ask you, and this is something that I have been thinking a lot about in my own research and my schools, but I don't quite understand how it works at Curious Cat and other schools that you all are familiar with, is what else besides democracy and leadership are you also teaching at the school? What else happens after the democratic education? What are they preparing for later in life? And I think that is a question that I see coming through some of the questions that were submitted to Mike and myself. So this is the central contradiction and the conundrum or the dilemma that a democratic educator has to wrestle with, which is, okay, so you understand children as being motivated and you understand children as having curiosity and wanting to know more about the world. But at some point, so you might use the metaphor of a fire burning, right? So you want to keep that fire burning. You want to keep that curiosity as fire burning. So what is the kindling for that fire? what are the small sticks and the paper and whatever that you want to feed into the fire to keep it burning? And I think the answer to that is partly experience with the world, direct experience with the world. So you see that in The Day in the Woods, for example. You see that in the direct questions and following those questions of students out in nature. And then I think there are other things that are not immediately accessible to students, but you still want them to wrestle with. Things that you want them to learn about, but you can't necessarily have a hands-on experience, or the hands-on experience is not immediately available to you. And so the question is, how can teachers provide that kindling to keep that curiosity going? And how can you possibly direct some of that curiosity so it goes in areas that you are hoping to develop, right? And so you're hoping to develop democratic thinking, but you're also hoping to develop mathematical thinking, literacy, numeracy, science, various different kinds of science, natural science, physical science. You're thinking about physical education, you're thinking about art, you're thinking about music, you're thinking about so many different things, and you have to make choices, right? And the choices are difficult ones, because the world of knowledge is vast. And if there's anything that you probably learned from your higher education, is that by the time you graduate from a college or from a university, you realize that what you know a lot more now than what you knew as a child, but what you know now is just a tiny scratch of the surface of what is possible to know, right? And so you can get many PhDs and many different, trust me, some Jesuits have tried. Jesuits in the United States are known for getting multiple PhDs. You can't get enough PhDs in this world to know even a fraction of how much knowledge there is out there. In fact, here's a little example that I like to think about is sometimes I go onto Amazon.com to buy a book. And at the bottom of the Amazon.com page, there's a ranking of how high that book is in sales in terms of all of the books that are being sold by Amazon. And very regularly, I'll buy a book that I think is just the most amazing, rich book, and it will be selling for 1 million, 2 million in terms of the rank of book sales. And I think to myself, okay, so how many of those books will I read in my lifetime? How many books will you actually read in your lifetime? And I would say probably an upper estimate is in the tens of thousands, maybe, right? So think about the millions of books that you will never read in your lifetime. And start to think about, okay, the difficult choices that we have to make about what we're going to teach our children, okay? But at the same time, we're not going to just give up and think the children aren't going to learn anything, right? So we want them to have some kind of level of knowledge that's at a high level, hopefully. You want them to be prepared for what happens after primary school. You want them to be prepared for secondary school, maybe college, maybe university, maybe a profession, maybe something else that has high expectations in terms of the knowledge that you're trying to impart on them. And you want them to be self-motivated, right? You don't want them to reach this high level of education or knowledge through just carrots and sticks, or through coercion, or through fear, right? You want it to be based on self-motivation, on curiosity, on love, on cultivating relationships through a community of learners. That's what we're hoping for, right? But we have to create that situation. We have to create situations in which that becomes natural. It becomes something that's an expectation. It's something that everybody seems to be doing, and there are resources to do it. And so, from my point of view, and from my experience and research, the resources that have to be available largely come from teachers. And they largely come from teachers' knowledge, which is why professional development is extremely important, and also why selection of teachers is extremely important, and parental and administrative support of teachers is extremely important. Okay, so I think about what kind of knowledge is necessary to become a teacher or to become a great teacher. And unfortunately, I think the answer is an infinite amount of knowledge is necessary to become a great teacher. And in fact, there are 4 what I call infinite pools of knowledge that are helpful to becoming a teacher. And it might sound a little bit trite to say that, but I think that there is a lot of knowledge that could be useful in different situations, and that knowledge has to be the kindling that keeps the curiosity going. And so teachers have to have this knowledge just in time. When the students are stimulated, when the students have this curiosity, because the curiosity might not last forever, right? So you have to be right there, right when the kid asks the question. Then do you have the resources to allow the student to then follow their question, and then to keep asking more questions after that, right? So the 4 infinite pools of knowledge that I like to think about are deep knowledge about a particular content area. Okay, so you might think of that content area as science or music or hopefully the teachers would be well-rounded in lots of different areas, but they also might have high standards in particular areas, right? So you might want a teacher who is involved in the world of knowledge, involved in the world of politics or some other thing that they have passion for and a really high standard for that particular thing, right? And so at the school that I taught at, we would hire oftentimes people who had maybe a profession before teaching, right? So we hired a professional carpenter, and that person had deep knowledge about woodworking, about building furniture, and about all kinds of things. And he used that in the classroom, right? We hired another person who was a professional musician. And that person created all kinds of learning. Even though that wasn't a music teacher, that person created all kinds of musical opportunities for students, and then was able to connect that deep knowledge that he had with the curiosities of the students, right? We hired other teachers who had very deep knowledge about particular languages, or literacies, or math, and so they were passionate and deeply knowledgeable about content. The second infinite pool of knowledge is one of how children learn, right? And so, of course, this is child psychology, developmental psychology, thinking about how children you might have a Piagetian lens where you think about the developmental stages that children naturally go through, and how to then analyze whether a child is ready for this activity versus another activity, right? Or analyzing whether a child is being overwhelmed with a particular activity. So then how are you going to change the curriculum so it becomes more appropriate for that particular child's developmental level, right? You might have a lens of attachment, so you're thinking about how to analyze the relationships the child has. How do you create a more socially successful environment for kids? Because kids have to have friends, and they have to have warm, trusting relationships. They have to have an inclusion within the group, right? So that's part of developmental psychology, and how do you then understand how to read children. And of course, that's an infinite pool of knowledge, because we're mysterious creatures. And there's still a lot of questions that need to be answered about how children learn and how they develop, and how different people have different ways of learning, right? So multiple intelligences, multiple forms of communication. You have people that are more literate, people who are more visual, people who have all different kinds of variations. And so we have to be able to read that. Another infinite pool of knowledge is the specific children that are in your class, right? So the teacher who is spending a lot of time with these children obviously don't know as much about the children as the parents. And so, of course, talking to the parents is extremely important for that. But also, what are some of the cultural assumptions that the children might have? What are the languages that they speak? What are the experiences that they've had? What are the fears they might have? What are the specific ways that that child learns in this world, right? So understanding the students directly in front of you is an infinite set of complexities that we have to have powerful assessments in order to understand who these children are, and to create a better relationship with them, and to figure out what they need at this moment in their lives, right? So that's infinite. And then the fourth infinite pool of knowledge is knowledge about yourself as a teacher. So knowledge about where did you come from? What are your experiences? What are your expectations? Are your experiences, do you see them as normative? Do you think that just because you enjoyed a particular author or a particular book when you were a child, that all of the children in your class are going to like that same author? Right? Do you assume that all the children are like you? And also, so you continuously reflect on your own life, and you continuously reflect on who you are, but you also think about what are the skills and what are the tools that you have, and how can you be useful to other people, right? And how do you develop those skills? How do you become tools? How do you become more useful to other people? Right? And so how do you, maybe do you ask people, you take very seriously the evaluations that you receive from other people? You might receive evaluations from parents, from the principal of the school, from the students themselves. You ask them. You try to be aware as much as you can about yourself and how you are presenting yourself to other people. Right? When you speak at a meeting, why is it that some people seem to have more influence than other people? This was an entire curricular topic that we had in our school in democratic education, which is whose voice counts, right? And that's an infinite and very complex issue. Why is it that when Deborah Meyer, who was the principal of the school, spoke, everybody just sat there and listened and wrote notes, and then they all nodded in agreement. But when somebody else spoke, and people just pretended like nobody had spoken, or somebody else repeated that same comment as if it was an original comment that had just been said by somebody else because that person was invisible, right? So I think we have to understand that, and that's part of what democracy is about. But it's also part of understanding who we are as people and reflecting on ourselves. All right. So then the last thing that I want to say is, so how do teachers create this balance between what we call at the Mission Hill School the emergent curriculum, which is children following their own curiosity and asking questions based on their own experiences in the world and their own curiosities. How do we balance that, which would be a real child-centered education, with teacher preparation, right? And it's a dilemma, because as a teacher, you want to be prepared for when they ask the question, and you want to be able to have those tools, those books, the opportunities, maybe a field trip, maybe a guest speaker, maybe other curricular ideas that you can use that kindling to get the students even more curious, even more invested, even more in pursuit of more knowledge, right? And so sometimes for that preparation, we need to plan in advance. And so, at the schools that I've been part of, we would plan all throughout the summer. And in the fall, we plan for both the fall, the winter, and the spring. And we think about, okay, what are the books that we need to purchase? What are the materials we need to get in the school so that we're prepared for the intense learning that's happening, right? And so that's always a balance. So the way that we solved it, or the way that we approached it anyway, was to have large, overarching thematic units, where we thought that with a large unit, we could kind of prepare in a very general way what it is that we would be studying, but then we would also pursue this emergent curriculum, the individual questions that would arise with those particular things. So oftentimes they were just kind of natural things. Yesterday I had spoken about the monarch butterfly curriculum, right? So the entire school would study monarch butterflies all together. And we would order all these monarch caterpillars to the school. And we would just kind of assume that once the students got the monarch caterpillars in the room, they would start asking questions. And sure enough, they did, right? So that's kind of a balance between preparation and the emergent curriculum, right? So then they would start asking these questions. Do caterpillars have eyes? How many eyes do they have? What can they see? How many legs do they have? Why do they have these stripes? What happens when they become chrysalis? Let's take notes on it. Let's take a journal based on our measurements and based on our questions and whatnot. And so that way we could get more of a balance. And I wouldn't say that it was a perfect balance, There were some students that weren't interested in monarch butterflies, right? They wanted to write fan fiction about a computer game that they were really into. Or other students have this abiding interest in dinosaurs or in, some other thing that the teachers just weren't going to be pursuing at that moment. Although, you could have some flexibility with that, right? So maybe all of us are going to study this one thing together, but then you'll also have some freedom where kids can pursue whatever it is that they're going to do in their choice time. And I think teachers have to deal with that issue, and I think there's not one single way to deal with that issue. I have to say, one of the most difficult aspects of writing the book that I did about Mission Hill and just thinking about professional development is, so I interviewed all the teachers of the school and I asked them, what is the most powerful form of professional development that you've ever had? And the problem is that different teachers said different things, and some of them directly contradicted each other, right? And so how does the school then use a limited amount of time in professional development that's going to be useful to everybody, right? So if you have, for example, a veteran teacher who's been teaching for 20-some years, and they teach 4th and 5th grade, let's just say, how are they going to benefit from the same experiences that a brand new teacher who's teaching kindergarten or 1st grade are going to also benefit from, right? And so our school dealt with that with using kind of a multi-pronged approach. And so we would have some sessions that we were all learning together, and maybe a particular teacher would present some idea. It might be an upcoming thematic unit and kind of talking about their experience with teaching that previously. Or we might have a math professional development where we actually had a math coach that would come in and talk about like how particular problems in math might be solved together. But then we also had separate professional developments where basically 2 weeks of the time throughout the entire year had to be self-organized by teachers. And so 1 week would be during the summer, and so the school would actually pay a stipend to those teachers to then go pursue their own professional development, whatever it is, and it would be paid for by the school. But there were a couple rules with that. One of them is that you had to apply for it and it had to be okayed by the administration. But the other thing is that you had to, well, it was preferred, almost mandatory, but I guess there were some exceptions. But you had to do it with another colleague. And so very oftentimes we do a whole week of workshops, for example. So I remember there was a wonderful resource in Boston where I taught that was called Primary Source. And it was a nonprofit organization that was dedicated only to professional development for teachers. And so they would put on workshops about particular topics that were popular. Then they would also collect curriculum. So they would have teacher-made curriculum that was freely available to anybody, any teacher who was going to be teaching that. And then usually the workshops would be creating curriculum as well, and then you would donate that curriculum to the library. And that was very powerful. Other times, teachers have made trips abroad to other countries that they were planning on studying, and so that would be at least partially paid for by the school. They would do other kinds of workshops. I tried to get guitar lessons paid for by the school one summer, and I said, I really need to learn how to play the guitar better because I'm trying to lead my students in singing, and I have this keyboard. I'm not a great keyboardist, and I also feel like the keyboard is between myself and the students, and so I really think a guitar would help. But I was not able to convince the administration that would qualify. So I had to pay for that on my own. But I did think that was really good professional development for my own teaching. And music teaches so many wonderful lessons, and it also creates community and that sort of thing. So teachers need to be engaged in the world, and they need to continuously be learning. The knowledge is infinite, so it's never going to end. So how do you create those experiences that are going to light the fire and keep the fire burning for students, but also for teachers, right? So how do you keep that fire burning for the teachers, even when they're veteran teachers and they've been teaching for 20, 30 years? How do they find students and the content that they're teaching to be endlessly fascinating? My point of view is that it is endlessly fascinating, but it's only fascinating if you're continuously learning, if you're always finding new things to pursue and new things to learn, right? So I guess I'll end it there. I don't know if that was 20 minutes or not, but I think we're going to open it up.